Paul Thayman's book Allegories of Reading started with a simple goal. He wanted to write about romantic literature, specifically about the famous writer Rousseau. But he ran into a problem every time he tried to figure out what Rousseau's text actually meant. He got stuck. These weren't just small misunderstandings, they were fundamental obstacles that made him question whether we can ever truly understand what any text is saying. So he abandoned his historical study and started asking a bigger question: what does it even mean to read something? His answer, which forms the center of this book, is both surprising and unsettling. Literature, he argues, is not a stable container of meaning that we can simply open up and access. Language, the very material of literature, is fundamentally unreliable. It resists our attempts to pin it down to one clear meaning. Every text, when read closely, tells the story of its own failure to communicate clearly. This is what Damon calls the allegory of reading, the text's own demonstration that reading is ultimately impossible. To understand Damon's argument, we need to look at three aspects of language that scholars have studied for centuries: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar deals with the rules of language, how words fit together to form sentences. Rhetoric deals with figures of speech, metaphors, similes, and other ways of using words creatively. Logic deals with reasoning and truth. Before Dayman, many literary scholars believed these three worked together harmoniously. A sentence has a grammatical structure which helps us understand its literal meaning. Sometimes we use rhetorical figures to make our language more vivid and persuasive, but these figures don't really change the underlying logic. For example, saying time flies is a metaphor, but we all understand it means time passes quickly. The grammar, the rhetoric, and the logic all point in the same direction. Damon argues this is completely wrong. He says rhetoric is the troublemaker. While grammar and logic support each other, rhetoric actively undermines them. Here is why. A single grammatical structure can produce two completely opposite meanings, one literal and another figurative, and the text gives us no way to decide which one is correct. Think about the question: what is the difference? If someone asks this during an argument, they might literally want to know the distinction between two things. But just as often, they are using the question to mean exactly the opposite. There is no difference at all. The grammar is identical, but the two possible readings contradict each other completely. The text cannot resolve this tension. This is what Damon means by deconstruction. It is not something critics do to text from the outside. It is something that is already happening inside every text, built into the very structure of language. Damon tests his ideas by reading famous authors. First, he looks at Marcel Proust, the great French novelist. In Proust's masterpiece, the narrator clearly prefers metaphor over other figures of speech. Metaphor creates meaningful connections between things. When he describes the buzzing of flies on a summer day, he is not just describing a sound, he is capturing the very essence of summer itself. This is a necessary organic link. Metonymy, on the other hand, which connects things by mere physical proximity or association, is dismissed as accidental and superficial. But Damon shows that Proust's own metaphors are secretly built on metonymy. For example, Proust describes the narrator's reading activity as a torrent of activity. This metaphor links amplitude. A torrent is vast, with coolness, a torrent is refreshing. But why do these two ideas go together? Not because of any necessary connection, but because the narrator is reading in a room next to the kitchen, where there happens to be coolness. The connection is purely accidental, it is metonymy, not metaphor. Process text, then, is doing something it cannot admit. It claims to be creating necessary, profound connections, metaphor, but it actually achieves its effects through accidental associations, metonymy. The beautiful harmony prose creates is revealed to be a rhetorical illusion. The text tells the story of its own failure to achieve what it claims to achieve. Damon finds his strongest philosophical ally in Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who argued that rhetoric is not an ornament added to language, but the very foundation of language. For Nietzsche, there is no such thing as literal natural language. Every word we use started as a metaphor or figure of speech. What we call literal meanings are just metaphors we have used so often, we have forgotten they are metaphors. Nietzsche's most radical insight involves cause and effect. Western philosophy assumes that causes come first and effects follow. But Nietzsche argues we actually experience things the other way around. We experience an effect, say pain, and then we invent a cause to explain it, say a pinprick. The cause is actually a projection we make after the fact. This reversal of cause and effect is itself a rhetorical figure called metalepsis. Philosophy, by asserting that causes logically and temporally precede effects, takes a rhetorical substitution, a figure of speech, and treats it as literal metaphysical truth. In other words, what we call philosophy is actually a branch of literature that has forgotten its own figural origins. Philosophy is just another text, and like all texts, it cannot escape the fundamental unreliability of language. The second half of Damon's book focuses intensely on Rousseau, examining how his political theory, autobiography, and novels all demonstrate the same linguistic problems. In Rousseau's political writings, Damon examines how language creates social structures. For Rousseau's political theory to work, the ruler must pretend to speak with the voice of God, a fictional metaphor. This fictional basis is what makes the social contract binding. But this means the political state is ultimately a verbal construct, a story we tell ourselves to maintain social order. The text shows that its foundations are fictional, but it keeps pretending otherwise. In Rousseau's autobiography, Confessions, Damon examines the famous episode of the stolen ribbon. As a young man, Rousseau stole a ribbon and blamed a kitchen maid named Marion, ruining her reputation. Years later, he writes his confessions to apologize and explain himself. But Damon shows that this excuse creates new problems. An excuse is a performative act. It tries to do something specifically to dissolve guilt. But the act of making the excuse generates endless cognitive explanations. Each explanation exposes new deceptions, creating new guilt. The text can never stop apologizing because every apology produces the need for another apology. This is not a psychological problem, it is a linguistic one. Language creates this endless loop. Damon's work has often been misunderstood. Some critics accuse him of turning literature into a meaningless game where any interpretation is as good as any other. Others accused him of destroying the moral and political value of literature. Damon insists exactly the opposite is true. Deconstruction is not a harmless academic game or a terrorist weapon of subjective relativism. It is a technical, rigorous methodology that forces us to confront the text as a linguistic battlefield. It removes literature from both the romanticized interiority of the self and the simplistic referential politics of the outside world. It forces us to pay extremely close attention to the actual words on the page and how they function. The allegory of reading is the realization that whenever we read, we are caught in an impossible situation. We must try to understand what the text means, which requires us to believe language can be stable and referential. But the very nature of language continuously undermines that understanding. Every time we think we have found a stable meaning, the text's rhetorical structure reveals that meaning to be an illusion. Damon's legacy is this uncompromising ascetic concentration on the technicalities of the text. He reminds us that reading is hard work. When we read too quickly, we miss the complexities and contradictions. When we read too slowly, we get lost in them. Either way, we risk hearing nothing at all. The text keeps telling us the story of its own impossibility, and our job as readers is to listen to that story, even if, perhaps especially because, it can never end happily.